Hey guys, this is Tech Howdy. I welcome you to another video tutorial where we are building this CMS application using ASP.NET Core 3 and Angular 10. In the last video tutorial, we were working on the registration component. We have pretty much finished the UI. The only thing that's remaining in this UI is the icons. And these icons, we will add them in a later stage where I will show you how to install the font awesome library and how to use it. But for now, most part of the UI has been done. We have implemented reactive programming on the form. So as soon as the inputs are touched, we will get the required error that we need this particular input to be filled out before we submit the form. Also, now we will be adding another service in our application. We have already created one common service called as validator service to validate the input fields to match them. Now we are going to create another service called as account service. Our account service will be responsible to communicate with the backend API with the registration endpoint that we will be creating for our front-end users. So let's go ahead and quickly add this account service in our application. So to add it, I'm going to run the following command: ng generate service in the services folder, and I'm going to call this service as account. I don't need the spec file, so I'll set the skip tests equals to true. By setting this flag, there'll be no spec file created. So now I have a service called as account service created under the services folder. Here we will go ahead and write the logic or the implementation that we need to communicate with our backend API. So here in the account service, we are going to add a endpoint that we are going to access to call the registration method and then register the users. We did a similar thing in the country service where we added the endpoint. So far we have not yet created this endpoint for our front-end users to register in the application. We will do that soon. Next thing, in the constructor we will instantiate the HTTP client object. Since we want to make HTTP requests, we need an HTTP client object. We added a registration method, and the registration method has the following parameters. These parameters are basically the values that are entered in the form that we are passing to the register method as parameters. I have not added the confirm password and the confirm email in the parameter. That's because I'm just validating it in the front end on the form, and I'm not going to save it in the database. I don't want any duplicate entries. Now the next thing I want to do is go to the interface folder, add a new file. I'll call this register.ts, and here I'm going to add an interface for registration. So as you can see, these are the same parameters that I am using, and I'm passing these same values over here in the account service. Now the next thing, I'm going to create an object over here called as register and register model, and I will give it a type of register. This is the interface that I just created. So I'm going to add the import statement over here. Now inside this registration method, I'm going to write the logic. So here I'm going to create the response model object. So I'm going to assign the values that I received in the parameters to the register model that I'm going to create of type register. So each value is assigned to the appropriate property that we have in the register interface. Next thing, we will make the HTTP call. So we will return HTTP dot and make a post request. Keep in mind this is a post request, not a get request. Our response type can be any, and then in the response in the method HTTP method, we need to provide the URL. So we have already specified the URL. Next thing, we need to pass in these values. We need to send these values to the backend so the user can be created or registered in our application. Also, a few things that we need to do is add the anti-forgery token as well from the cookie to the header, because we are going to protect our APIs against any kind of CSRF attacks. We spoke about this in the anti-forgery token video that we had uploaded, and I showed you guys how to create and implement anti-forgery tokens in this application. So next thing that we want to do is set the header values for this HTTP request. So let's go ahead and add it. So here we will set the headers as the second parameter in this request. Here I have passed the headers key and I have specified the value as a JSON object where I have the values in key value pair, where I have set the content type to be application JSON, and then I have set the no auth to true. This flag, we will talk about this as we approach to the JWT token implementation, but for now no auth true, which basically means that this particular request will not have any authentication token attached to it. So because we are registering the user, we don't need to attach an authentication token because the user is not yet registered or logged into the application. And then we have the XSRF token, which we spoke about in the anti-forgery token video tutorial, that we attach to make requests to the endpoints to prevent any unauthorized access from third-party websites or third-party scripts. So here I have left this value blank because we need to get the XSRF token or the anti-forgery token from the cookie in our browser. So as we know that the anti-forgery token, the XSRF token that we have created, is stored inside the cookies. And to access this, we can use basic JavaScript to go ahead and fetch the cookie based on the cookie name. But in this application, we are going to make use of a package from npm that will help us to get this cookie from the browser. Let's go ahead and open the terminal and let's install this package npm install. The package is ngx-cookie-service. So ngx cookie service will help us. It has the methods that we can use to access and fetch cookies from the browser storage. So let's hit enter and install this package. So the package is now installed. If we go to the package.json file, we should see an entry for the package ngx cookie service. And just to confirm that it is installed, we can go and check, and here we have a entry. Now we can use this. So we will go ahead and instantiate this cookie service in the constructor. So let's go ahead and add this service over here. We will also add the missing import statement. So the missing import statement, once added, we will not see any errors. Now we will use this cookie service to get this cookie with the name of XSRF token and attach it to the headers of this HTTP post request. So here, using the cookie service.get method, we can get the value of the cookie. All we have to do is pass the name of the cookie as a string, which I have done over here. Now we would want to also go ahead and attach these values in the body of the request. So let's do that. So the body should be the second parameter, keep in mind. So I'm going to add it over here. The register model that we created is the body of our request. So we will pass it in the HTTP post request. As I see here, the body is the second parameter and the headers is the third parameter. So when you hover over the post method, you will see the values and their order. So I have passed the body as the second parameter and the headers as the third parameters. Now the next thing that we would want to do is go ahead and pipe this result to manage the response. So we'll use the pipe method. And then next thing that I want to do is map this response. So we will have to import map from RxJS. So go ahead and add the import statement, import map from RxJS operators. So now we can then use map, and inside the map operator, here we are going to manage the response. So we are going to get a result because of this HTTP call that we are conducting. So once we have the result, we are going to check if the result is valid, and if the result we are going to return this result. But if we get any error, then we are going to return the error. So there can be two scenarios where we will receive a result where the user would be registered successfully, or the user could not be registered due to some error in the input values, or due to the error in the data that we send to the backend, or we can receive an error. Error can be caused due to multiple reasons. If the server is not available, there is some issues with the application, so we will receive an error, so we will return the error. So this should be it for the registration method. We don't need to do anything else over here. All we have to do is to call the HTTP post method, and then once this register method is called, the user's registration would be processed. So now we will go back to the uh, register component.ts, and here in the registration component.ts we have to call this registration method that we just created. So we will go back to the component registration component HTML file, and here in the registration components HTML file we are going to add a ng submit event, so that when the form is submitted, this event is fired off. And when this event is fired off, we are going to call a method called as on submit. So we have not yet created this method, so we will go ahead and create this method over here. So now when this method is called, this method will call our registration method from the account service. So before we go ahead and write the logic inside this on submit method, we need to add two methods. Actually, one method that we would use will be to show the errors on a model. So if there are any errors, we will show it on a bootstrap model. We will load the model pop-up and we will show all the errors on that model. Second, if there is any other errors, like an error 500 where our server is down, which is not the user's fault, so we will show a toast notification to the user instead of a model pop-up. And to show toast notification and to show the model pop-up, we are going to install two packages. So let's go back to our terminal window, and in the terminal window I'm going to add two packages. First is the toast service package, and second is the bootstrap types package, because we are going to call the bootstrap model over here using the jQuery functionality. So we would need a types package for bootstrap as well to be added, and then the reference needs to be added over here in this jQuery in this types array, that where we have added the jQuery types references. So let's go ahead and add these two packages. The first package is npm install add types bootstrap. We will go ahead and add this package. Once we have added this package, we will copy this package name and then go to the app.config app.json tsconfig.app.json. In this array we will add a comma and then add the bootstrap types reference over here. Next thing that we want to add is the toast service package, so let's go ahead and add it. If you don't see the option when you hover over the toast service, you can just add it manually. So import toast service from ngx toastr, and I spelled it wrong over here, so it should be toaster service. So now we have toast service enabled. Now we will go ahead and create the method to show errors. Show model error, This is the extension method that I'm going to call when I'm going to show the errors on the modal pop-up. So I've just added 3 lines of code in this show modal error method, which is I've set the modal title to be registration error, modal message to be your registration was unsuccessful, and then the modals show event to show the modal. So if you go to the register component.html, I have already added the modal in the HTML code, so you should find it at the very bottom of this HTML code or the document. And here I have specified the ID, which is error modal, and that's the ID we are targeting over here to show that specific modal. Now in the onSubmit method, let's go ahead and add the logic. So here we have added the logic for the onSubmit method. This method will be called when the form is submitted, registration form is submitted. Here in this method, we have used the account service, therefore we have instantiated the account service in the constructor of this component. We would also need the router module so that we can route the user after the user is registered to the login page. Navigate the user to the login page once the registration is successful so that they can log in to the account. Now we have also added an import statement for account service and router, and also for suite alert so that we can alert any errors that we find during the registration process. First thing here we are doing when the form is submitted is we are setting this is registration process to true, in process to true. So initially we set the value to false. Now when the form is submitted, this value will be set to true. And once this value is set to be true, we will see a loader that will load in the browser, which basically implies that there is some process going on in the application. Next, we want to get all the values from our registration form and display those values or save those values in this object called as user detail. So I've created a variable called as user details, which will save all the values that we receive from the registration form, which is a form group object. We will get all the values using the dot value property. By calling this property, all the values from this form we can assign it to this variable called as user details. Next, during the account service object, we will call the dot register method that we just created to register the user. Here we will pass all the parameters, that is basically the values that we receive from the form, and then we will subscribe to the result. When we receive the result, if the result contains a message which is equal to registration successful, so we will assign this message from the backend, and I will show you when we create the registration endpoint how to set this message. If a user registration is successful, we will send this message as a response, and if the message contains this response, then we will fire off the SWA or the suite alert pop-up, and we will show the message as registration successful. Once the registration is successful, message is seen on the screen. We will set a timer so that the user can be automatically navigated to the login page. So I have set a timer, and once the timer is complete, that's for like 10 seconds, and the user will then be directed to the login page. If there is any error during this registration process when we make a call, and if the error.status is 500, we receive a 500 error, which basically means an internal server error. There can be multiple reasons for server error. As I mentioned earlier, there can be loss of internet connection, there can be server down, or there can be so many other issues that can cause the internal server error. Maybe your API endpoint is not performing or working. So if we receive a 500 error, then we will show the alert or the notification on a toast message. And if the error has a value which is not 500, then we will all the errors that we receive, we will put it in a error array, and then we will show it in the model that we created over here. So the next thing that we want to do is go ahead and set the registration flag to false, where if the registration failed, so we can hide the loading icon or the loading spinner that we see. I should also be adding this to the end after the subscription. If the registration is successful, we should also be closing or hiding this particular registration in process value. So I'll set it over here as well, which makes more sense. So now that should be it for this registration method. Now we have some errors on our registration page. We cannot load it. So let's go ahead and inspect and see what these errors are. So we have some errors related to some services with Toast, and the reason we find these errors because in the app module we have not yet injected these services, but we are trying to use these services in our components. So let's go ahead and add them to the app module so we can get rid of these errors. So here inside the imports, I have to add the toastr module, which is responsible for creating the toast service. So I'm going to import it from the ngx toastr package that we installed. Next thing, I will also add the cookie service to the providers because I would need that over here. So it's available in the components. Now I will go to the registration form and I should not see any errors. So we were getting the error related to the toaster module because it was not added. So we have added it now and it's imported in all the components. So now the registration method is complete. We don't have any errors, but our registration would not process because when the registration button is clicked, we are going to call an endpoint, and we have added that endpoint over here in the register method, which is this URL, account, controller, and registered method. So if we go back to the application's API endpoints that we have in this application, so I have the controllers, we have API version 1, and here inside this version 1 API, I need to add the account controller because I have not yet created it. We have an account controller which is part of the areas for admin, but we are not going to target that. We are going to target an API endpoint, so we have to create it. So let's go ahead and create this API endpoint quickly so that we can access it and also add the token validation, that's the anti-forgery token validation for that particular endpoint. So let's go ahead and create it. So here I'm going to add a new controller, and I'm going to call this controller as account controller. I'm making sure that this controller inherits from controller base. That's because this controller does not have any views. It's an API endpoint, so I don't need to inherit it from controller. Next thing, I'm going to add the attributes over this, or the filters over this controller. So here I have added the API version, which is 1.0. API controller, I've specified this is an API controller. I have added the route for this particular controller, which is the controller's name, but before that we have to specify the version number as well. And then I have set the filter for validating anti-forgery tokens, and I have set it to auto. When we use auto validate anti-forgery tokens, it will validate every HTTP post requests that are coming in, and it will check if it has any tokens, anti-forgery tokens in the headers. So if any request other than HTTP guest comes in this controller, it will be validated for the token because we have this particular attribute. Okay, as I specified in the video tutorial that you can set it individually on each methods, but I'm going to set it here because I want it only on all methods except the HTTP GET methods. So now next thing we will do is go ahead and we need a constructor so that we can instantiate some services using dependency injection, so we can use it in the API endpoints. So we will instantiate the following services. So here I have instantiated the services that we would require for the registration method. We are going to instantiate more services as we add more API endpoints in this account controller. For now, for the registration method, we will require just these two endpoints. We will also need reference to Serilog, so I have added the import statement because we are going to log errors. Now the next thing that we want to do in the model service, we are going to add a model that will map over the properties that we receive from the front end to this model that we are creating. So we are going to add a new class, call this class as register view model, and create this new class. We don't need a constructor in this register view model, and here we will add the following properties. Here these properties are the properties that I am going to pass from the registration form to this register view model, or map over to this register view model. So if you have added additional properties over here or additional fields in your form, you can map those values to the model and expand this register view model accordingly. So once we create the register view model, the next step, we will go ahead and create the API endpoint for registering the user. We will call this endpoint as register. So here I have added the register endpoint. This endpoint will have a HTTP post type on it. Here we are going to pass the register view model from the form, from the registration form. So we will receive this in the request body. Therefore I have used the from body attribute. So if we go to the API register service in the Visual Studio Code, we will see that in the account service, here the register model, we are attaching this particular values to the body of the request. So therefore we are going to use the from body attribute in the account controller to tell the register method that the values of the register view model will be found within the request body. Next step is we are going to create or register the user. So this register user async method, we have to create this in the user service. So we have a user service over here. Inside this user service, we will add this method because we are not going to put any logic over here. Instead, we will put it in the register user async service, so that if we want to use it somewhere else in some other area or some other client app that we are building, we can use it from the user service. If we add it over here, then we will only be able to use it within this particular application. So I've added it to the user service library. So now we have to go ahead and create this register user async method in user service. So let's go ahead and add this method over here. So here I have added the register user async method. This register user async method is going to return a response object. We'll go and create this response object first, then I'll explain why I have created this response object. So in the model service, we will add this response object. So we will add a class. We'll call this class as response object. And inside this response object class, we will add three properties. So here I'm going to add three properties. One is a Boolean property called as isValid, which will specify if the response is valid or invalid, the message of the response, and whatever data the response contains will be stored in this dynamic property. I have specified the type as dynamic because we don't know what the response type or data type would be. Therefore, setting dynamic, we can add any type of property in the response. We can use this response object to send response on API endpoint calls. So for any API endpoint calls, when we want to send a response, we can use this response object. This is basically going to be a generic response object that we will use for every type of API response. So in this case, we are going to send a response object back to the account controller with the following data. So let's start understanding this method. So if our method contains any errors, I have created an error list. I've instantiated this list or initialized this list so that we can add any errors to this list. Then I have initialized the response object because we are going to send it in the response of this method. we are passing the register view model as the parameter to this method. Now inside the try catch block, if there is any error, we will catch the exceptions and log it in our log file, and then we will return the response object. Since we have already initialized this response object, we will be sending it as a response, which will basically means that the response object is either empty or null. So now the next thing in this try block, in our registration form, we are not adding any profile image to the user's profile when they are registering. Therefore, when the users are registered in our application, we will set the default profile image. We have already added a default profile image in the images folder. We have already explained about this particular feature, how it works. We have used it in the admin panel when we are creating new users. So to set default images, we are using that default image from the image folder. So we know that there is no image over here, so we will set the default image, create a path for it. Next, we will create our application user object because we are using ASP.NET Core Identity, and application user extends ASP.NET Core Identity. So the identity model is expanded with the following properties or the additional properties that we use. We will add the values that we receive from this register view model. We will map it over to the appropriate property. So if we receive the email, we will map it over to the email, username to the username, and so on. Now every user that will register in our application from this registration form, their user role will be set to customer by default. So I have hard coded the value over here. Next thing I have done is the user address. So since we are only going to receive the country of the user, not the entire address, so I have just added the country and specified the type as billing and shipping. Next, I'm going to create a result object. So we are going to use the user manager, which is part of ASP.NET Core Identity. We have already instantiated this particular object using dependency injection and used it in the other methods in this particular class. So we are going to use the same user manager object, and the user manager object contains a method called as create async, where we can create users in our ASP.NET Core Identity model. All we have to specify is the user object, which is going to be of type application user, and the password to create the user. The password will be the password that the user has provided us in the registration form. If this result is succeeded, it will return a boolean value, either it's true or false. So if the result.succeeded's value is true, then we will go ahead and add the user to the role customer. Then we will create a confirmation code using the generate email confirmation token. This is also an inbuilt method of ASP.NET Core Identity User Manager. So we can call this method to generate a email token for the specified user, and then we will create a dynamic dictionary which will store two values, the code and the user, so that we can return it in the response object. A response object contains a data property which is of type dynamic. So we are going to add this dictionary that we created with two values, code and user, to this data property, and the message we will set it as success, and the response object will be true. And if there are any errors, we will add them to the error list, and then in the data we will set the property value as the error list, and we will set the message as failed and the is valid property to false. So this is how we will set the response object. If it is true, we set the message success, and if it's failed, we set the message as failed. We will return this response object. Now the next thing that we want to do, since we are extending this particular class with an interface, we need to add this method to our interface. So let's go ahead and add it. Once we add it to the interface, we should be able to access this method inside the account controller. Now, as you know, we are going to receive the result, which is of type response object. So here we are checking if the message is success and the response type is valid. Then we are going to create a confirmation email and send it to the user. Now please note that the confirmation email, the email confirmation template is already created when we worked on the email service. So if I go to the email service in our application, the email templates folder already contains this particular template. We had already created this. So we will log an information saying in the log file that we have created a user, and we will return the response back to the client. In the response, we will specify the user's username, the email, and the message that registration is successful. Now, if you remember that this message which says registration successful, if we go back over here in the register component.ts, here we are checking if the result.message is registration successful, then we will redirect the user to the login page after we show the sweet alert pop-up. So that's what we are trying to achieve over here. We are trying to see if the message contains the value registration successful, and if not, then we will loop through the errors. So now if we go back to the account controller, our registration is pretty much complete. So the registration method is pretty much complete. Now the only thing that we want to do is test this registration method. Now when you are testing this registration method, as you know that if the registration is going to be successful, we are going to send an email to the user. So keep in mind that I have already deleted the email settings. So in the app settings file, I have already deleted the email user key for SendGrid and for SMTP. So if you are testing, make sure you update these values accordingly and then you test it, otherwise you will not receive any email. So let's go ahead and now run this application so that we don't get any errors, and if we do, we will fix it. So the application is loaded. We'll go ahead and now test our application to make sure that if we can register new users in our application. We will go ahead and create a test user, and we will check if the test user is created. We will also check in our database if there is an entry for the user. As you can see, we only have 2 users currently in our database, and when we register a new user, we should see another entry in this ASP.NET user table. So let's go ahead and test our registration form to see if it is working as expected, and if not, then we will fix any errors that we see during this process. So I have filled out the registration form with test user details. Also in my database, I have currently 2 users, and when we create new users, we have to provide unique username and unique email. Currently, I have updated this email address of the existing user so I can reuse it to test my inbox if I receive a registration email. Also, I have in the registration form used the same username so that we can check if we receive an error when we try to create a new account with a username that already exists in our database. Now we will go ahead and test the functionality. As I mentioned to you earlier that in the app settings files, go ahead and update the email settings so that you can receive emails. If you are using SMTP options and using your own Gmail account to receive emails or to test the sending of emails, make sure in your Google account settings under security tab, you check off this option to less secure apps. You turn this on. If you do not turn this on, then Gmail will block sending emails to your account, and it will receive an email saying that someone was trying to access your account, whereas it was you who were trying to use your own Gmail account to test a application. Therefore, while testing the application, you can turn this feature on for less secure apps, and once your application is finished testing, you can turn off this particular feature, which is less secure apps under the security tab of your Google account. So in the inbox, I will receive an email now when I register a new user. So let's go ahead and test by submitting this registration form if we are successfully registering a new user or we receive an error. So if I hit register, as expected, since I have a username that already exists in our database, I received an error from ASP.NET Core Identity where a username TechHowdy is already taken. Therefore, registration was unsuccessful. Let's go ahead and change this username so that we can register a new user. Now I have changed this username. I will go ahead and register a new user. Currently, I have not received any email because the user was not registered. So I will go ahead and register this new user. Now I hit register, and now you can see that the registration was successful, and I have seen a timer that's loaded which will redirect me to the login page. Currently the login page is not yet set. We will see certain errors in the console. That's because we have to fix certain values in the login component before we load it. So we have not yet worked on our login component, therefore you will not be redirected. But now we need to test if we received the email, and yes, we have received an email with the email template that we had for registering new user. That's the email confirmation template, and you will see the subject as well as the verification link that can be clicked to register the new user. Since we have no login form yet created, we cannot test the registration, or we cannot log in into our account or verify our email. So we will do that when we finish the login feature. But for now, the registration was successful. So let's check in our database if we have a new user entry. So I will run this query, and now we see we have a new user entry with the username tech234 that we just created, and this user has a entry in our ASP.NET user table. So the user is currently added to the ASP.NET user table, and if you look at this user's ID and go to ASP.NET user roles, you can see that this particular user has a role ID of 2, which is the role of a customer. By default, we are adding the users to the customer role, therefore the user has got a role ID of 2. So in this way we can register new users in our application, and I have shown you how to register new users in your Angular application using the ASP.NET Core Identity feature. Now in the next video tutorial we will work on the login functionality. A login functionality will include a lot of features like token refreshing, login in the users, expiry of the tokens, and so on. We will do that in the next video tutorial. If you have any questions about this video tutorial, you can use the comment section. For the code will be provided in the dev of repo. The link will be also provided in the video description. Thank you once again for watching this video tutorial. Do not forget to like and subscribe our channel TechHowdy.